So Rich, we took a look at using Photoshop to assemble the time lapse. Real easy, straightforward, but for me anyway, I want to kind of do everything where I'm doing all my other work, right? I'm doing most of my work, say, in Adobe Premiere Pro or Final Cut Pro 10. It'd be nice to sort of build a time lapse in my editor.
Yeah, and one approach to doing that is to import an image sequence. So you're actually just going to use File, Import in this case, and point it at that folder. Okay. Now, I've got, fortunately, my recently used folder, so I could just jump right to it.
Right, sure.
And go to the first image, select it, and make sure image sequence is checked.
Now, the important thing here, the reason that Premiere Pro in this case was able to figure out, and Final Cut Pro 10 would work in a similar way, that this is an image sequence is what?
Is that they're consecutively numbered.
Right. If you have 11, 19, 32, 4, you can kind of, there's ways to get around it, but the easiest thing to keep your sanity is just to do sequential numbering of the files.
And here's the crazy thing. Final Cut Pro 7 can recognize an image sequence and make a movie. Final Cut Pro 10, last time I checked, couldn't, and that's going to be our second workflow we show, which is bringing them all in and dumping them in a timeline.
Sure.
But let's do the easy one. We'll hit Import, comes all in, there's a movie file.
Yeah, so it comes in as one single file.
And you could right-click and modify Interpret Footage, where you could assign a new frame rate if you wanted that to be 2396. Or here's an idea. Maybe you want it to be 12 frames a second, so it uses each frame twice.
Right, and this is kind of a hard thing to get your mind around. Because this is originating from images, still images, unlike a movie, you can just tell Premiere how long you want each frame to be. A lot of people ask, well, aren't I ruining the quality of it by stretching it out or making this? No, you're not. You're just saying, hey, play this one frame for X amount of time.
And it's time lapse. It's not like it's full motion fluid video. It's going to be, by its very nature, a little choppy.
Of course.
So don't drag this into a new sequence. Instead, make a new sequence and set it to what you want. Okay. So we're going to say, well, I want a new sequence. Let's pick 1080p 24. We'll come on over here to the settings. And so I'm going to go ahead and get an interim file here. We're going to go ahead and set this. And in this case, I'm going to go with ProRes, which is fine. And here's the good news. The brand new version of Premiere Pro actually supports a 64-bit version of Apple ProRes.
Now, just to be clear, what we're doing here is that sequences inside of Adobe Premiere Pro don't actually have, unlike Final Cut Pro 7, sort of codecs native to the sequence. All we're doing here by choosing this as a preset and then going to editing mode and custom is that by default, most of these sequence presets, when you render something on the timeline, it's going to render it out to an iframe only MPEG codec, which is not as optimal or as high quality as you could get. So by changing this to custom and then coming down to the preview file format and changing that to QuickTime, you can choose different codecs. Also, just keep in mind, you have access to ProRes on this machine because we're on a Mac and because you have other Apple professional products.
Oh, you don't even need to. ProRes is included with Creative Cloud version now. They licensed it, but if you're on a PC, you can use Avid DNx HD and just pick one of the high quality ones. These are both very efficient codecs. And so we're going to do this for a little trick in a moment. So it's all good. I'll hit OK. There it is. And grab this and drop it into the sequence and make sure we do not change the sequence settings. Okay. Now at this point, it's too big.
Yep.
Same problem we had in Photoshop, right?
Absolutely.
So we'll just go to the Motion tab and we'll scale that down a little bit.
Yep. And one thing that's funny too about the motion or the effects controls here in Motion is a lot of people don't realize that you actually have a wireframe mode too if you want it, just by clicking that little button right there. Yeah. There you go. You got handles to move things around and just drag on screen too.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's our shot. It's framed up. You could apply filters, effects, anything you want. But again, these are really big files, and we're playing them off of a drive that's relatively fast. But if we want to get the best quality, hit the return button and let those frames process, and it's going to generate a video file.
And again, this is why we changed those sequence previews to generate into ProRes.
Yeah, now that's going to take a little while, but let's go ahead and show you the second workflow though with an NLE, and that's pretty easy. What we're going to do here is bring in all of them into a folder. So we make a new folder, and I'll just name the shot, and this is because this time we're going to import all of the images.
Right, now we brought in all the images last time, but we did some auto-magical stuff behind the scenes when we said image sequence.
Right.
It brought it in as one file. This time, we're going to have however many ever it is, a couple hundred of these individual TIFF frames.
So I select all, and image sequence becomes unchecked, and we say import, and it brings in all of those files. Now, this is not as convenient from a media management point of view, But this sometimes works well because people will edit them in individually to time them, especially if they're doing something like stop motion where they want to retime the frames independently. Like,
Absolutely.
oh, this one for 10 frames and this for 2. That's really meticulous, but there's kind of a middle ground. Premiere has a new feature in the automate to sequence command that lets you set a specific duration for all the frames.
Right, and automate the sequence is a functionality that's been in Premiere for a long time, and I think of it sort of as the retirement video functionality of Premiere Pro, right? That I can go through and I'm making markers on a piece of music, and then I just go, let's take all these old photos and time them out to those markers as a way of quickly building a sequence. But in this way, I think it's actually pretty cool because of what you said. We can actually sort of change the duration of individual frames.
Yeah, and we can automate that and change them independently with trimming. That's the slow method. Figure that one out on your own. Just use the trim tool, go through, it'll work.
All right, so we got all these guys in there.
We can select all these guys. Let's target our timeline here. And I got that. We select them all and click the Automate to Sequence button.
Yep.
And there's a new option here. So we're going to say put those in the sort order, put them in sequentially with an overwrite edit, and set a duration for the number of each frame. So how about 3 frames
per image?
Yeah.
Okay.
So now that's all cool. We're not going to do a transition or anything. And when I click OK, it adds them in, and each one is 3 frames long.
Now, we still have one problem here, though, of course. All of our images are scaled up still.
So select them.
Yep.
And you can go ahead and nest that.
Yep.
That's going to drop it down. So it's nested, which makes it in its own sequence. And all I want to do here is just go to the first image. I'll just say, let's use this one. And we could basically adjust the scale inside of that container and the position, just like we did before, right?
Yep.
And then it's really easy. So we select the clip in the timeline, and we'll choose Copy.
Yep.
And then select everything else and just right-click and say Paste Attributes.
Yep.
And all we're going to do is take the motion property.
Cool. So click OK, and then if you close the nested sequence.
Yeah, and you see everything else updated, right?
Yeah, and if you close the nested sequence back where it's nested, there you go. Now, I think just one thing that needs explaining is that the reason you do the nest is simply because on your main timeline where you're editing everything else together, you don't have, whatever it may be, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of individual frames.
Yeah.
It's easy to nest that, so on your main edit sequence, it acts as one single clip.
I can grab it, drag it around.
Exactly.
I could apply a color correction effect to it, so it's pretty easy.
Cool.
All right, so there's 2 ways of doing it. It works the same pretty much across the board in any NLE. When we come back, we're going to take a look at After Effects to give you one more tool in your bag of tricks.